Imagine being dragged through iron doors, the torchlit corridor echoing with the cries of the condemned. For women imprisoned in medieval Europe, this wasn't a scene from legend. It was the brutal beginning of incarceration. The moment a woman crossed into a medieval prison, known as a jail in England or a gaols in France, her identity was stripped away, often quite literally. One of the first recorded steps in several European prisons was the shaving of her head. This wasn't merely a hygienic measure, it was symbolic. Hair, especially for women in medieval society, was intimately tied to dignity, modesty, and femininity. Removing it was an act of degradation and submission. After losing her hair, the woman faced even worse treatment. Heavy iron chains were locked around her legs and arms. These metal restraints were called bilboes in Old England. Women were chained to cold stone walls, unable to move freely. It didn't matter if they were actually guilty of a crime or just accused by someone. The chains went on either way. Records from cities like York and London from the 1200s show that all women prisoners got these terrible iron restraints. These prisons were not built to help people become better. They were just horrible places where women were thrown together with thieves, people who owed money, and those waiting to die. Most prisons were just parts of old castles, churches, or town halls that had been turned into jail cells. The rooms were freezing cold, always wet, and made of rough stone. There were no separate areas for women prisoners until around the 1400s, which meant women had to stay with dangerous male criminals. A German legal expert named Ulrich Tingler wrote in 1509 that women should be confined and made to feel shame. This shows how people thought back then. The goal wasn't to teach women to be better people. Instead, the goal was to embarrass them and make them feel completely alone and worthless. The whole system was designed to break their spirits completely. The first things that happened to women prisoners having their heads shaved, being put in chains, and being shown to the public were more than just being locked up. These acts were meant to take away everything that made them human. It was the start of a journey that would destroy them not just physically, but mentally too. For women living in medieval times, going to prison wasn't just about being locked away. It was the beginning of being completely erased from society. In the darkest parts of these medieval prisons, there were special cells that killed people slowly and quietly. These tiny rooms were called hunger chambers by the people who wrote about them. Many women who were put in these cells never came out alive. The cells were so small that a person could barely lie down. They had no windows, no beds, and almost no food. Some were underground rooms that you could only get to through a trapdoor in the ceiling. In France during the 1300s, these underground cells were called oubliettes, which means the forgotten place. Once a woman was lowered down into one of these holes, she was rarely brought back up. Some of these terrible cells were cut right into the rock under castles. Famous places like Loches Castle and the Bastille had these death traps. When the door closed above them, most prisoners never saw sunlight again. Officially, starving prisoners wasn't always listed as a punishment in the law books. But in reality, guards often stopped giving food to prisoners as a way to torture them. Old records from English prisons show that women accused of moral crimes or suspected of being witches were kept locked up without bread or water for days. This was especially common for women who were accused of breaking moral rules or practicing witchcraft. The conditions in these tiny cells made suffering happen much faster. Without toilets, food, or warmth, even healthy women got sick and died quickly. Women often had to lie in their own waste, covered with bugs and painful sores. Death usually came from not having enough water, not having enough food, or from infections that slowly poisoned their blood. But for many, the mental torture was even worse than the physical pain. Many prisoners screamed for days before they finally became quiet forever. When these women died, their deaths were often not written down anywhere. Their names were left out of official records, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside the prison walls. The starvation cell wasn't just a way to punish people. It was a deliberate way to make women disappear completely. It was a place where women were neither executed nor set free. They were just left to vanish slowly and quietly. This system had a terrifying effect on other women in society. It taught them to fear not just being found guilty of a crime, but even being accused of one. For the women who were put in these dark cells, punishment wasn't announced publicly. It was just suffered in silence. Forgotten by the law and by history, they died without anyone knowing their names. Their suffering was absorbed by the cold stone walls around them. In medieval Europe, the idea of crime was closely connected to religious rules and moral codes. For women, being labeled as a sinner could lead to brutal punishments even if they hadn't committed any violent crimes. Just being accused of adultery or other so-called immoral behavior was often enough to bring the full force of both government and church justice down on them. Once they were found guilty, many of these women carried their sentence for the rest of their lives because they were permanently marked on their bodies. Branding with hot iron was legally allowed in parts of Europe, especially by the late medieval period. In England, branding was used from at least the 1200s for crimes like stealing or for people who committed crimes multiple times. By the 1400s, it was also used on women accused of vice crimes. A law from 1563 under Queen Elizabeth allowed the branding of vagrants, which often included women labeled as nightwalkers. This was a term used for suspected prostitutes. They could be branded with the letter V permanently burned into their skin. Earlier records also exist. Court documents from 1300s London and York record punishments for women arrested for common misconduct or living without proper supervision. Branding, while not written about as much as whipping or public shamming, was sometimes mentioned in city records as a visible mark of disgrace. In Scotland, under a 1424 law, repeat offenders, including women considered unmannerly or idle, could be subject to marking with iron. Records from the Bridewell Palace in London, which was turned into a prison by King Edward VI in 1553, show how women charged with prostitution were regularly whipped and publicly shamed. Some were also branded, though surviving records don't always say exactly what symbol was used. A 15th century legal expert named Fortescue wrote that the correction of sin is visible to all, that others may fear and not fall. This shows the main idea behind branding, punishment that was made permanent and public. Branding wasn't used everywhere or all the time. Its use was different depending on the area and time period. But when it was done, especially to women, it carried not only terrible pain but a permanent loss of social status. A marked woman could not easily return to normal life. Her skin spoke for her, often louder than any defense she could ever make. Branding was a tool not just of punishment, but of permanent moral condemnation. For women labeled as immoral, it meant living as a walking symbol of disgrace, and this was done on purpose. Before any fires were lit or verdicts were announced, many women accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe spent long periods locked up in prison and being tortured. These tortures weren't punishments that came after being found guilty. They were tools used during questioning, often before a formal trial ever began. Under both government and church systems, the logic was terrifyingly simple. Truth must be forced from the body through pain. By the late 1400s, accusations of witchcraft increased dramatically, especially after a book called the Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1487. This legal and religious manual was written by church investigators Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It argued that women, by their nature, were more likely to practice witchcraft and lie about it. The book endorsed the use of torture to force confessions from accused women. Torture was officially allowed under Roman law and church law, as long as there was strong preliminary suspicion. In Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and parts of France, torture devices were routinely used when questioning suspected witches. The strapado was one of the most common methods. It involved tying a woman's arms behind her back, lifting her up by a rope, and then suddenly dropping her. This caused intense pain and damage to the shoulders. Other recorded techniques included thumbscrews, which applied severe pressure to the fingers until they broke, and the boot, which squeezed the legs using wooden wedges until serious injuries occurred. The rack, used mainly in England and nearby countries, stretched the body to the point where joints were damaged, often causing injuries that lasted forever. These methods were used while the accused woman was still legally considered innocent. What makes these acts even more horrible is that confessions under torture weren't just extracted from women, they were expected. And often, these women were forced to name other women as witches too, which led to even more arrests. In some German towns, this led to entire communities of women being wiped out. In Wurzburg between 1626 and 1631, over 150 women were executed after confessions were forced from them through torture. In medieval witch trials, the prison cell became a place of judgment before any trial even happened. Torture wasn't a sentence that came after being found guilty. It was a method for creating the story that the authorities wanted to hear, long before any verdict was announced. Medieval prisons showed clearly how fear and religious beliefs can turn law into a weapon, changing justice into ritual humiliation and slow death. These cruelties toward women changed legal codes and strengthened male power in society. and their effects can still be seen today whenever authority is used to control morality.